The South Canadian River ran muddy and low that evening, its surface catching the last amber light of dusk like broken glass. Despite its name, the river was nowhere near Canada. It was the longest tributary of the Arkansas River, stretching over 1,000 miles from Colorado into Oklahoma. Leland Dorsey climbed up its banks and stumbled out of the tree line, his clothes torn and soaked through, river weeds clinging to his boots. Scratches crisscrossed his arms and face, some still bleeding fresh. He moved like a man walking through a nightmare he couldn't wake from. At his truck parked crooked on the gravel access road, Leland yanked open the tailgate with shaking hands. The cooler sat there, dented and crusted with dried mud. He flipped it open and grabbed a beer, then another, downing both in desperate gulps. The empty cans clattered into the truck bed where half a dozen others already lay scattered. The woods seemed to press closer in the gathering darkness. "Not gonna get me," he muttered, wiping beer foam from his mouth. "Not today." He climbed into the cab, hands still trembling as he turned the key. The engine coughed to life and he pulled away from the river, leaving deep ruts in the soft earth. In his mirrors, the water disappeared behind the trees, but he kept checking anyway. Something had happened down there by the water, something that made a man's eyes go hollow and his voice shake when he spoke. But the real horror was still to come. The Knox trailer sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by scrub oak and the kind of quiet that settles over small Oklahoma towns after dark. A yellow porch light cast sickly shadows across the gravel drive as Leland's truck pulled up, engine ticking in the silence. He sat for a moment, staring at the modest home. Through the lit windows, he could see movement. Jimmy's kids going about their evening routine, probably wondering when their father would come home from his fishing trip. Leland grabbed Jimmy's tackle box from the truck bed, along with a pair of mud-caked boots. The gear felt heavy in his hands, weighted with more than just river water and memories. The front door opened before he could knock. Jimmy's teenage daughter appeared first, her face lighting up with expectation. Behind her, the boy, maybe 16, peered over her shoulder. "Where's Dad?" the girl asked, looking past Leland toward the empty truck. Leland stood there, dripping river water onto their welcome mat. His eyes wouldn't meet theirs, fixed instead on some point beyond their shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. "He's not coming back." The daughter laughed, a nervous sound that died quickly when she saw his expression. The boy stepped forward, studying Leland's wild appearance, the scratches, the wet clothes, the hollow stare. "What do you mean?" the boy pressed. But Leland was already turning away, dropping the tackle box and boots on the porch with a dull thud. He walked back to his truck without another word, leaving Jimmy's children standing in the doorway, confusion turning to something darker as the silence stretched. The boy grabbed his mother's phone and dialed 911. Detective Calvin Ridge was 3 hours into a stack of paperwork when Deputy Sonia Rivas appeared in his office doorway, holding a call log that made her frown. "Teen called in something weird," she said, dropping into the chair across from his desk. "Says a man just told him his dad's not coming back. Kid described him as looking like he crawled out of the river." Ridge set down his pen, already feeling the familiar itch between his shoulder blades that came with cases that didn't add up. Man got a name? Leland Dorsey. Was supposed to be fishing with the missing man. Jimmy Knox. Rivas flipped a page. Gets better. Dorsey's own daughter just called. Says her dad came home talking about killing Jimmy. Ridge was already reaching for his jacket. 23 years in law enforcement, and he'd learned to trust that itch. People didn't usually announce murders unless they'd actually committed them. "Call Dale, tell him to meet us at Dorsey's place," Ridge said, holstering his service weapon. "And Sonia, drive fast." Leland Dorsey's trailer sat on 5 acres of scrubland, the kind of property where a man could drink himself to death without bothering the neighbors. Ridge counted at least 20 empty beer cans scattered around the front porch as they pulled up, the headlights catching the aluminum like scattered coins. Dorsey himself sat in a lawn chair, surprisingly upright for a man who'd apparently been drinking all evening. He held a fresh beer but wasn't drinking it, just staring out into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. Ridge and Rivas approached cautiously, hands near their weapons but not drawn. Dale Mercer's cruiser pulled up behind them, gravel crunching under his tires. Leland Dorsey? Ridge called out. That's me. Dorsey's voice was steady, clear, not slurring, just empty. We need to talk to you about Jimmy Knox. Without prompting, without even looking at them, Dorsey said, I done it. Had to. The words hung in the night air like smoke. Ridge felt Rivas tense beside him, ready to move if Dorsey suddenly decided he didn't want to talk anymore. What did you do, Leland? Ridge kept his voice gentle, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. For the first time, Dorsey looked directly at him. His eyes were bloodshot but focused, carrying a weight that made Ridge's skin crawl. He was going to summon it. That thing. The tall one. I seen it watching us. Dorsey set down his beer with deliberate care. Had to stop him before it got us both. Rivas moved behind him, cuffs ready. Leland Dorsey, you're under arrest. Something in Dorsey's voice, in the way he'd said, I done it, like he was reading from a grocery list. That was the sound of a man who knew exactly where the line was and crossed it anyway. The interview room at the Red Hawk Sheriff's Office smelled like disinfectant and bad coffee. Dorsey sat across from Ridge and Rivas, swaying slightly despite being stone sober now. His eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room, as if something might be lurking there. Tell me about yesterday evening, Leland, Ridge said, keeping his voice neutral. Start from when you and Jimmy got to the river. Dorsey's story came out in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror that wouldn't quite fit together. He described Jimmy howling into a pipe, making sounds that weren't quite human. Claimed he saw something watching them from the tree line, a figure 12 feet tall with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Jimmy was calling to it, Dorsey insisted, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his tale. Making that noise, that howl, I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Said it was just fooling around, but I seen what was watching us. So you attacked him? Rivas asked. Had to stop the summoning. Dorsey's matter-of-fact tone made Ridge's skin crawl. Grabbed him around the throat. He fought some, but I held on. And you held him down how long? Ridge leaned forward. I don't know, until he stopped making that noise. Rivas excused herself, hand over her mouth. Ridge stayed, watching Dorsey's face as he described choking the life out of his fishing partner. There was no remorse there, no recognition of what he'd really done. You didn't stop a monster, Leland, Ridge said quietly. You became one. Getting Leland Dorsey to explain where he'd left Jimmy Knox was like trying to nail down smoke. The river took him, was all he'd say, rocking slightly in his cell. Down where the water bends. Ridge organized a search team that included Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agents and half the county's deputies. They worked through the night with flashlights and prayers, checking every bend and eddy along the South Canadian. By morning, they'd found nothing but beer cans and fishing line. It was the buzzards that finally gave Jimmy away. Late the next afternoon, a drone pilot spotted the dark birds circling a debris pile 2 miles downstream from where Dorsey claimed they'd been fishing. The body was caught in a tangle of fallen trees, waterlogged and starting to bloat in the Oklahoma heat. Ridge waded out to examine the corpse, the river water cold against his legs. Jimmy Knox had been a big man in life, but death and the river had reduced him to something pale and terrible. Bruises covered his throat and arms, and his fingernails were torn and bloody, signs of a fight. Ridge measured them with his eyes, exactly the width of human hands, thumbs positioned just where the deepest impressions marked the throat. Matches what he told us, Ridge said to Mercer as they waited for the medical examiner. Grabbed him around the throat, held on until he stopped squirming. Mercer surveyed the debris-choked bend where they'd found the body, then glanced nervously at the tree line. Well, I'll keep an eye out for Bigfoot, just in case. In case Dorsey was only half crazy. Ridge didn't laugh. The evidence was clear enough. No mythical creature had done this. Just a man with both hands and a mind too fried to know the difference between reality and delusion. The medical examiner's report confirmed what Ridge already knew. Jimmy Knox had died from prolonged manual strangulation. The bruising patterns were consistent with someone gripping his throat for several minutes, long enough to crush the windpipe and cut off blood flow to the brain. Toxicology came back more interesting. Methamphetamine in Dorsey's system, high levels, enough to fuel paranoid delusions, but not enough to completely disconnect him from reality. But the blood work only told part of the story. The forensic psychiatrist painted a more complex picture during her evaluation. Years of drug and alcohol abuse had fundamentally altered Dorsey's brain chemistry, creating a maze of damaged neural pathways where reality and hallucination intertwined. His prefrontal cortex showed signs of severe deterioration. The part of the brain responsible for impulse control and rational decision-making had been slowly poisoned by decades of substance abuse. This isn't a case of someone choosing to be evil, Dr. Jody Green explained to Ridge during her consultation. Leland Dorsey is a victim of severe chronic mental illness exacerbated by substance abuse. His perception of reality has been fundamentally compromised. When he saw that creature in the woods, his damaged mind genuinely believed it was there. She paused, reviewing her notes. The tragedy is that underneath the addiction and psychosis, there's likely a person who never wanted to hurt anyone. But years of self-medication for untreated mental health issues created a perfect storm. Drug-induced paranoia layered on top of existing psychological damage, not full psychosis, but close enough. He was scared, delusional, living in a reality none of us can fully comprehend. Yes, he still retained some awareness of right and wrong, but that awareness was filtered through a mind that could no longer distinguish between genuine threats and chemical phantoms. Ridge interviewed Jimmy's son again, taking detailed notes about Dorsey's demeanor when he delivered the news. It was the way he said it, the boy explained, his mother's arm around his shoulders. Like he was telling us the sky was blue. No emotion, no nothing. He said it like it was a fact, like we already knew. Dorsey's daughter painted a similar picture. He said it 5 times that night after he got home. I killed Jimmy. I had to. Like he was trying to convince himself it was true. District Attorney Lydia Marsh was a practical woman who'd prosecuted enough murder cases to know when the facts spoke for themselves. She met with Dorsey's court-appointed attorney in her office, surrounded by case files and coffee cups. Your client confessed to multiple people, she pointed out. He led us to the body. The physical evidence is overwhelming. The defense attorney, a young public defender named Gary Bradley, looked tired already. He was suffering from drug-induced paranoia. He genuinely believed he was defending himself against some kind of supernatural threat. Doesn't matter what he believed, Marsh replied. What matters is he knew choking Jimmy Knox would kill him, and he did it anyway. Bradley waived the jury trial, fearing that 12 citizens would focus more on the Bigfoot delusion than the underlying mental health issues. Judge Patricia Hendricks approved the bench trial, and preparations began in earnest. Ridge spent hours organizing his notes, ensuring the timeline was bulletproof. The psychiatrist would testify that meth fueled Dorsey's delusions, but not enough to qualify for an insanity defense. He believed the story, sure, Ridge told Marsh during prep, but he also knew how to finish it. The courtroom was nearly empty on the morning of Leland Dorsey's trial. A few reporters, Jimmy's family, and the usual collection of courthouse regulars filled the gallery. Dorsey sat beside his attorney, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, staring straight ahead with the same hollow expression he'd worn since his arrest. Judge Hendricks called the court to order, and the prosecution began building its case. Marsh laid out the facts methodically. The fishing trip, the confession, the discovery of the body. Each piece of evidence clicked into place like bullets in a chamber. The defense leaned heavily on the tragic deterioration of Dorsey's mental state. Bradley painted a picture of a man whose mind had been slowly destroyed by years of untreated mental illness and subsequent self-medication through drugs and alcohol. Your Honor, Bradley said during his opening, Leland Dorsey didn't commit murder out of malice or evil intent. He is a victim of a mental health system that failed him, a victim of addiction that consumed his ability to perceive reality, a victim of brain damage so severe that he genuinely believed he was fighting for his life against a supernatural threat. The man sitting before you today is not the man he was before years of substance abuse rewired his brain and distorted his reality. Bradley presented evidence of Dorsey's deteriorating mental state over the past decade. Emergency room visits for panic attacks, neighbors reporting him talking to invisible people, his own family's desperate attempts to get him treatment that never materialized due to lack of resources and insurance coverage. This is what untreated mental illness looks like when it collides with methamphetamine psychosis, Bradley continued. Leland Dorsey made a tragic mistake while his damaged mind was trapped in a chemical nightmare. The real crime here is that we as a society failed to help him before it reached this point. But when Ridge took the stand, his testimony cut through the psychiatric explanations like a blade. He told me Jimmy was howling to call the monster, Ridge said, consulting his notes. Said he had to make sure Jimmy couldn't do it again. That's not fear talking. That's intent. Marsh's closing argument was simple and devastating. There was a monster in the woods that night, Your Honor. But it wasn't Bigfoot. It was the man sitting right here in this courtroom. The real monster in this case is Leland Dorsey. Judge Hendricks deliberated for less than an hour. When she returned to the bench, her expression gave nothing away. The defendant has admitted to causing the death of Jimmy Knox through manual strangulation, she began. While the court acknowledges the defendant's impaired mental state due to drug and alcohol abuse, this does not rise to the level of legal insanity. Ridge watched Dorsey's face as the words washed over him. No reaction, no recognition, just that same empty stare. The court finds Leland Dorsey guilty of murder in the first degree and sentences him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The bailiff moved to escort Dorsey from the courtroom. As he passed Ridge's seat, their eyes met for a moment. Ridge saw nothing there, no remorse, no understanding of what he'd lost or taken. Just emptiness, like looking into a well at midnight. Jimmy's family embraced in the front row, tears mixing relief with grief. They had their justice, but it wouldn't bring back a husband and father who died for the crime of making noise by a river. Ridge found himself walking along the South Canadian River a week later. The case haunted him, the senselessness, the insanity. He couldn't shake it. As he followed the same path where Dorsey and Knox had fished their last time together, he wondered what must have gone through Jimmy's mind as his high school friend turned on him. It was almost too much for Ridge to contemplate. The woods were quiet, peaceful. The sound of moving water and wind through the trees were relaxing. No monsters lurked in the shadows, and no Bigfoot watched from the tree line. Leland Dorsey wasn't wrong about monsters, Ridge thought as he drove away. He was just looking to the wrong place.